was born in Ghana, West Africa. Father's from Ghana, mother's from Japan. Grew up in London, live in the US for the last 20 so years, and Mexico partly now. So I feel like I'm from everywhere and nowhere, a citizen of the world.
Yeah.
Felt that way my whole life. From a very young age, I always felt a deep calling to help people in some way. As a young boy, I felt a real um, I was a very empathetic kid, so I would feel people suffering very deeply. And um, there was a part of me that always wanted to alleviate people suffering. I didn't know what that would look like. And so, uh, you know, it's always been with me, this desire to inspire, to help, to make a difference. And I didn't know what that would look like as a kid. I grew up in a kind of maybe unusual environment. It didn't seem that unusual to me at the time. It just seemed really normal. And I think that was a blessing because in what I thought was normal, I grew up with a sense of possibility. And so my first memories as a young boy were, I remember being a chubby kid lost in the crowd and seeing a crippled woman who couldn't walk pick up the sand that this man walked on, wiped it on her face and stand up. And so week after week, I grew up seeing blind people see and deaf people hear and people stand up out of wheelchairs. The same man whose sand she picked up would look at a woman in a wheelchair and say, why are you in this wheelchair? You're not sick, stand up. He would look at a person with crutches who hadn't walked in 10 years and say, why do you have these crutches? Let them go. And they would be healed. He put his hand on someone who maybe had hearing issues and their hearing was restored. So this man was my father. And so I grew up with this, you could say, miracle working father, spiritual figure. He was a spiritual teacher and guide to heads of state, the King of Ghana. Many people. Three heads of state in terms of Ghana, presidents, two kings. I mean, the list goes on. Kind of iconic man in Ghana. He had over probably 400,000 followers at his height. 300 churches in Ghana, West Africa, a huge church in London, about 5,000 people. And so I grew up in this environment, but I thought this was kind of normal. I thought everyone's life was miracle, so to speak. And, I grew up seeing this with my own eyes, no one around, just witnessing it every day, every weekend. And so when I was age 8, I was ordained as a minister. When I was age 8, I started speaking in my father's churches. And when I was 14, I was ordained as a minister. And so that began my whole journey down a certain path. But when I was ordained, I knew in that moment that this was not my path. I knew in that moment that this was not my purpose in this life. This was not my destiny. And my father didn't speak to me about it. And so it was just announced and everyone was happy but me. And I looked into my future and my heart sank because it just didn't feel aligned. It just didn't feel right. I always wanted to help people, but it just didn't feel right to do it through religion or the church or my father's organization. But, as a 14-year-old kid, I didn't have the courage, so to speak to my father. I didn't have the courage to tell him how I really felt. I didn't have the courage to be who I really was. My fear was if I spoke my truth, then I would lose the relationship. I'd be outcast, I'd be alone, I'd be abandoned. I think so many of us as human beings, we hold back our truth. We hold back who we really are. We hold back our authentic expression, our gifts, our talents, our creativity, our voice in an effort to get love and validation and approval. And so that's what I did. And 4 years, said nothing, went through a tremendous kind of internal questioning, depression, conflict questioning. But when I turned 18, I really didn't have much of a choice. I had to make a decision. The decision was, I felt this calling to come to America, basically. And at 18, I wanted to come to the US because I started reading self-help books from a very young age. And all of the teachers and the authors, at least in the US, we're talking like, Jim Rohn, Brian Tracy, Deepak Chopra, Zig Ziglar, Marianne Williamson, Louise Hay, Wayne Dyer, they all live in Southern California. And so for me, this was the Mecca. And there was a calling in my soul to come to the US. There was a calling in my soul to come to America. And, it didn't make sense. And sometimes I think what your soul guides you to do doesn't always make sense to your mind, or is not always logical, not always convenient. But I felt this undeniable calling, and it was pulling me. And so I felt as though I knew what I had to do, but I was terrified because of the consequences of what that might mean. And I looked into my future, and I projected. Like, I saw I could follow the expected path for my life and be successful, take over my father's church. But if I didn't have my soul, if I didn't have myself, I felt such a sense of self-betrayal that if I didn't have my own integrity, then what kind of success is that? And so I felt this deep sense of self-betrayal and soul suicide of following a path that was laid out for me. And I knew what I had to do. And that's when I spoke to my father, told him I'm not taking over. Uh, we didn't speak indeed for like 2 years. It was rough. It was difficult. It was challenging. And longer story short, I ended up uh, winning a green card in the green card lottery, the
Oh,
DD1
that
green
is a
card lottery.
winning. Yeah, that is a
Yeah,
lottery.
literally. And that's what brought me to the US, and went and found teachers, and many of the folks I'd read about, studied with some of them, and then traveled to, like, things really transformed and shifted because then I traveled to like Israel, studied years later. Israel, studied with rabbis in Thailand, studied with some monks, and ended up in India. All roads, spiritual roads lead to India. Ended up in India and had some really profound experiences there. And from that, I came back again to LA, to the US, and began working with people one on one. And that grew to one on one. And people started coming, the word started spreading very organically, pre social media. One person came, their life transformed, and people started coming from around the world. And it just grew and
Mhm.
evolved and evolved and just expanded from there over the last 20 years.
Uh, Thanks for that background. Your father was in the Christian lineage. I mean, it was like, I am assuming.
Yeah, my father was an interesting character because by the time I was born, he was a very, shall we say, mystical person, less traditional Christian, a more mystical Christian. In that, in the 60s, he had gone to India and had these, shall we say, enlightenment experiences. And so by the time I was born, I think which was a huge blessing, he was very open. And for him, like, Christ wasn't just a person. Jesus was a man who, shall we say, realized his Christ consciousness and his own true identity that we all have access to. Christ is a consciousness that is inside of us all. And so my father was very metaphysical in nature, but he taught through his churches in a very spiritual and metaphysical way. And that was a blessing. On my father's bookshelf were books from people like Yogananda and Nisargadatta Maharaj, to Blavatsky, to Uspensky, to Gurdjieff, to Krishnamurti, to Osho, to Wayne Dyer, like everything across the board, spiritually, to aromatherapy, homeopathy. And so
Yeah.
this is kind of what I grew up, what I grew up in. But when he first started, he was very much Orthodox Christian, and that's how we began, and he just evolved.
Because in some ways, like the rebellion you seem to have had from going in that lineage and his path, I don't know. I mean, looking back, do you feel like your interests now aren't that far off from your father's in a sense? What was it you wanted to not be a part of? Was it the structure, or you really wanted to get out to a new
Yeah,
country?
there was a few things. It was, I don't even know if it was a rebellion, because it didn't feel like, I mean, to be honest, it was harder for me to leave than to stay, uh, because I loved my father, even though we weren't super close on a human level. Like, I looked up to him, so I didn't feel like I was rebelling. I just felt like it wasn't my path. I just felt like the shoe didn't fit. I
Mm.
just felt like I had a different destiny. So it wasn't like I'm gonna rebel against you. It was more like something's not quite right, and I want it to be right. I wish it was right. Like, God, please, like, I pray it's right, but it just isn't. And uh, it wasn't anything like major or in particular. Firstly, it just didn't feel right. But there were a couple of things that, there was a few things. Like, I remember, um, like my father being a miracle worker. People would come to my father, thousands of people, to
Yeah, that's
perform miracles.
wild. Yeah.
It's wild. And I would look at that and it was like amazing. Yet for me, what I didn't like, what I remember being a kid thinking, what I didn't like was the dependency. People were looking outside of themselves, whether it was to him, whether it was to something outside of themselves for the solution to do it for them. And really what I wanted him to take the lead in creating was more of a culture of teaching people who they were, teaching people about the truth of their own essence and their own being and their own power, and giving people the tools and the structure to be able to, shall we say, generate their own miracles within themselves, rather than being constantly dependent on coming to church and going to him for the miracle and for the prayer. And it just felt like a sort of limited dependency model, which I didn't like. And I think he knew that, but also people wanted the miracles, man. They wanted the show, they wanted the miracles, they wanted the easy fix. Let's just like hit me up, and do it to me, do it for me. And so I didn't like that, because I felt like people, even as a young teenager, I felt like people weren't really going to evolve. They weren't going to really grow. Give a man a fish, teach him for a day, but like I wanted him to teach people how to fish. And so we had a few differences, but overall it just felt like I had a different path. And what I really saw very clearly is you cannot be truly fulfilled and happy being someone that you're not. You cannot be truly fulfilled and happy following someone else's path. And I just had a different path. My soul had a different trajectory. And I really believe through my life experience, through experiences like that if you, like, I really believe that if you follow your soul, the soul has its own intelligence. It's connected to all. If you follow your soul, if you follow your knowing, if you follow your truth, you'll always end up in the right place. Even though the route that you take might not be the one you expect, you'll always end up in the right place. And once I won that green card, which I didn't know how the hell it was going to happen, that was kind of like another confirmation for me of the support of the universe, that I was in the flow, that I was, even though it was difficult and challenging. Like sometimes people think when you follow your path and you follow your purpose and you follow your destiny, you follow your dharma, your soul's aligned calling, that things are easy, like everything just manifests effortlessly. And I think sometimes when you follow your path and you follow your truth, things begin. That's when the difficulties often begin. And many times people think that, I'm following my truth and I'm facing these challenges, it must mean I'm on the wrong path. No. And I think many people give up because they're faced with all of these challenges. And I think sometimes that can be a sign that you're on the right path, because when you're following your true purpose, it's almost like there's moments where you have to go through a challenging phase. And that challenging phase, I believe, is a gift sent to us because we're on the right path, to prepare us for our purpose, to prepare us to be able to fulfill our purpose. If you look at people like Mandela and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, what they went through, and to me, the challenges were preparation, soul tests, that really force us to cultivate the mental, the emotional, psychological, spiritual muscle, let's call it soul force, to be able to fulfill our destiny. So there was a lot of challenges, but I'm glad I persevered.